My name is John Pellegrine. I can try to describe my malady to you, but really there's only one person who can truly understand, and that's Mandy. It has to do with doors. Let's say, for example, you come home at night, and you step up to your front door under the weak porch light, maybe the sound of crickets and wind all around, and you put the key in the lock and turn it. You've been gone for hours. It's dark. At that moment, how can anyone cross that threshold without fear? Any number of things can be waiting just inside that door, in the shadows. For me, at the age of 8, it was Miss D, my babysitter, who had died of a drug overdose. My foster mother had dropped me off at Miss D's house and said, "Go on, she's waiting for you. I'll be back at 10. I pushed the front door open, called out, got no answer, and went deeper in. They told me I found her in the tub. My memories of that were totally blacked out, thank God, by a forgiving brain. But that's just one of the many things that can be waiting for us at that moment, that threshold moment. At 16, it was something far worse. I was living with a different foster mother in Tom's River by then. Oh, she was hard. Slowly, she was driving her other foster son, my foster brother, crazy. His name was Scott. Even at 22, Scott couldn't escape her harshness. He had a very irregular children's show on public access TV. Bruce Caboose, it was called. He and I never talked much. He would spend the time he wasn't working at a toy store avoiding our foster mom and writing the scripts for his shows in an upstairs room. I never watched them. Nobody did, really. One night I came back from studying at the library and I knew something was wrong the second I put the key in the lock. I pushed the front door open real slow. All the lights were out. When I turned them on, life took another great step into the surreal. Although the 2 hours before and after I discovered the body were, again, blessedly erased from my mind, just like with Miss D. They found me collapsed on the street after screaming myself into unconsciousness. You know the scariest thing about what Scott did? What he did to our foster mom? Scarier even than killing her with an axe. And maybe this is just urban legend because I sure as hell didn't look any deeper into it after I testified at the trial and ran away to Edison. They say he was telling everyone what he was planning to do right there on his skeezy children's show. None of the tapes exist anymore. They were all confiscated. Supposedly there's a couple of clips on YouTube, but yeah, from the stories he told to the kids, to the puppets he sewed by hand, to the weird allusions he made to his life at home, Scott was broadcasting, at some point near the end, his intention to murder her. So, you can understand how my nightmares started and then intensified over the years. After a couple of bad reactions to antidepressants and getting nowhere with expensive cognitive processing therapy, nothing seemed like it would ever truly help until I simply started going to a free group over in Highland Park that talked about their troubles, sleep troubles of all kinds. That's where I met Mandy. Her nightmares were actually more extreme than even mine. Ours happened at about the same rate, about twice a week, but sometimes she woke up screaming and thrashing around. That only happened to me once every few months. It was really kind of amazing, us coming together like that. a bookstore clerk and a waitress at a chain diner. No money between us. Both tortured by nightmares. It was just responding to a public post online, and we went to the meetings and we made friends there. And she and I began going out. On our second date, we played mini golf, and we were drinking sodas at the snack bar just after dark. And we got a little more into our issues, stuff we only wanted to talk about with each other. It was true, I left the door to my apartment ajar sometimes when I was out. Mostly on nights I wouldn't be getting home from work till very late. Only twice had anything been stolen. It felt like a small price to pay, to not tremble and shake and to have trouble breathing when I put the key into the lock. And that came and went, by the way. I never knew when or why it would flare up. Sometimes I'd be fine. The nightmares have always stayed consistent, though. I can't even begin to describe the range of awful imagery I've faced in my sleep. I told Mandy I'd always been convinced there was going to be a third surprise behind a locked door in my life, because bad things come in threes, right? I couldn't ever shake that belief. I took a little chance with Mandy that night of our second date and asked her why she'd never talked in group about what first caused her nightmares. Well, she said it was because she didn't trust people not to judge her, or maybe even laugh at her. I knew then that she really, really liked me because she brought me into her confidence about it. One Halloween night, when she was 6 years old, Mandy's stepfather had sat with her and put on a marathon of horror movies. No trick-or-treating for her that year. The weather was terrible, cold and rainy. She had never seen a horror movie before. Starting at 4 o'clock, there was The Wolfman, then Frankenstein, then The Mummy, then finally Dracula. All the old black and white classics. Mandy had been scared to tell her stepfather how terrified she was for more than 6 straight hours, but also fascinated. He didn't seem to think they should do anything else but sit there and watch. By the time Mandy went to bed, the first nightmares were likely already forming in her mind, but they didn't actually start till a couple of years later. Now, you or I, or millions of other people might see those old flicks as harmless, but for whatever reason, those images were translated into Mandy's mind as something much more disturbing. "You have to think of my nightmares," she told me that night. "Like you're watching real found footage of these monsters attacking and killing people. That's what it's like for me," she said. I had to imagine standing on a dark street and watching a woman dragged into an alley by a half-man, half-wolf, and hear her shrieks as she struggled. I had to imagine a child laid out on a coroner's table under a bright white light, and see the horrible black and crimson marks on the child's neck from where a mummy strangled her when she came across him in the reeds behind her elementary school. I had to imagine what it might be like to see teeth actually puncture the skin of a nun who was deceived into letting Dracula into her tiny room in a tiny convent, the moonlight flooding in, and hear her terror and witness her physical agony, unable to move or speak. All these things happened in Mandy's nightmares, an endless stream of violent featurettes, always something different and ghastly, torturing her mind until the fear of going to sleep ruined her life. She even had one therapist suggest she write out violent monster scenarios to cleanse herself. Yeah, right. Some years after they first started to happen, the monsters themselves faded but were replaced by an awful, shapeless black force forming from a kind of mist and blowing toward her on the wind, as if it were the physical manifestation of all those movie monsters blended into one relentless entity that now wanted to kill her. She would run from it. She would fight back. She would point to it in her dreams and scream for the people around her to help her. No Halloween spook houses for Mandy on the big day every year, not ever. We've made each other better. I think you should know that. The first night I stayed over at Mandy's place, she had one of those episodes, and I calmed her down when she awoke, kicking away the blankets in terror. Just a week after that, it was my turn to wake up violently. Many times I saw Scott in my nightmares, chasing after our foster mom with the axe. In real life, he had chased her out into the yard and then all the way back inside, she bleeding everywhere. In the realm of the nightmares, he hacked off a part of her in almost every room in the house, and I screamed at him desperately to stop. When I was with Mandy, the door thing wasn't such a big deal for a while. She helped me talk through it more, and only one time in every 6 or 7 did I lose my nerve before opening my apartment door and have to call her to drive over in her old Jeep and open it with me, something I guess I'll always be a little ashamed of. Me and Mandy, two bruised people suspicious of all the costly treatments we have available to us. We've been about the group, the really cool group that has made our life easier. I mean, I know we need to stop drinking so much and messing around with the drugs and give the shrinks another hack at our subconscious and our bank accounts. She and I have talked about moving in together, talked about it pretty seriously, but it's hard to figure out a bold move like that when you have two people who have multiple issues in life to work through. It's just hard. The homeless ex-convict wakes up under the overpass on Plainfield Avenue when an SUV with a bad muffler rumbles high above him, the first car to cross over in almost a half hour. It's still nowhere near sunrise. He swears under his breath and rolls over on his mattress. He is startled to see a bulky, masculine shape lying just a few feet away. No one has intruded upon his place here under the overpass for months. Whoever it is, his upper torso lifts off the cold cement in one long, creaky motion, arms hanging limp. His head turns with the awkward rhythm of a marionette's puppet. The homeless man says, "This is my space, okay? Why don't you leave me alone?" Without a sound, the intruder begins to crawl towards him. There's a smell like motor oil and a wet animal. The homeless man sees this person's face now in the dark. Weirdly green and puffy, it seems to have been stitched together and is about to split at the center seam. One eye is only half open. The homeless man screams. Knees digging into the filthy mattress, his attacker partially raises himself and clumsily brings both fists up, touching them together high above his head, and thrusts downward with all his might. The force of the single blow breaks the skull, and death is instantaneous. Last night, I drove back to my apartment from Stoke State Forest. Mandy and I had scraped together some money and gotten a nice cabin up there for the weekend. Treated ourselves a little bit. The plan was to go out and do a little hiking, listen to music, cook out in the open air, just relax. She'd done 2 50-hour weeks at the restaurant back to back and really needed some kind of break. And yes, I left the apartment door ajar when I'd gone to pick her up. When I do this, I leave the lights on and the TV playing at very low volume so no one thinks anything is seriously wrong. Nothing got taken. I woke up this morning in a sitting position on my sofa. I must have been more exhausted from the late-night drive home than I realized. I took a long shower and got into bed for real. I called out sick to work. I'd been scheduled to do the 1 to 9 shift. There was just no energy left in my body. The thing is, my mind was very, very unsettled. I couldn't figure out why there was a massive gap in my memory. My images of the weekend simply stopped Saturday evening until the time I woke up on the sofa this morning. Mandy and I had gotten to the cabin, gone for a long walk, made dinner, and sat outside for a little while until it got too cold. We listened to an old radio drama she'd downloaded onto her phone, and we went to bed at about 10. And then there was just a blank space where Sunday should have been. It wasn't even certain just when we'd driven back. Strangely, I found her purse in my glove box. That's where she'd put it when we got out there. She never took it with her when we got back to Edison. I called her to let her know first thing, but she wasn't answering her cell. When the chemist regains consciousness, she is aware of being dragged slowly along the cold, cracked dirt floor of some enormous, dim enclosure, face down. Yet she cannot move. Her limbs are useless. She can only endure the constant scraping of her skin on that unyielding surface. When her eyes can focus again, she sees thin streaks of blood as her cheeks are slowly shredded. The dragging stops, then starts again, then stops for good. Now she hears someone moving above her and a faint moaning sound, barely human. Her sweater is hiked up, exposing the small of her back. A large, shaking hand touches her there. The fingers are wrapped in some sort of cloth. They press down clumsily, cruelly, then move up her back, under the sweater, toward her neck. These are the last few seconds of her life. The third time Mandy and I spent the night in her apartment together, this was back in July, she told me she'd been feeling and sleeping better when she did something that might seem ridiculous. She liked to have a knife, a big Bowie knife bought from a trail outfitter shop, beside her on the night table. She felt then she at least had a symbolic defense, that she wasn't lying down helpless against the force that emerged out of the dark more than once a week. I would soon learn, of course, how bad those episodes could get. One time, I woke up to Mandy screaming and stabbing the air with that knife, barely recognizing me for a good 5 seconds before she became calm. Another time, when I was having some insomnia, I had watched her as she half rose from bed, repeating one sentence over and over as tears streamed down her face. "I will carve your headstone, unbeliever," she was saying, and had no idea why when I frantically woke her up. She told me only that a movie monster had come for her in her dream, a newer monster after years of not seeing them. This time it was Candyman, bringing death to the town we lived in. Mandy hadn't been crazy about the idea of the cabin at first. She's not very outdoorsy. I picked her up Saturday morning to set off for Stoke State Forest. We ate pancakes and eggs at a Denny's in Byram and listened to Velvet Underground as we drove. When I woke up on the sofa this morning, my shirt was sticking to my chest a little, and there was some pain all throughout my skin there. At some point on our trip, I had suffered some shallow wounds, not much more than scratches, except for one. I washed them in the shower. As I was drying off, someone from the diner where Mandy works left me a message asking if I knew where she was. She hadn't shown up for her shift. 4 hours ago, I decided I needed to drive back to the cabin. Just before I left the apartment, I realized something. Today is Halloween. I'd even bought a bunch of candy to hand out, but suddenly I wasn't going to be there. So I filled up 2 soup bowls with Mounds bars, mini Twizzlers, and Smarties, and wrote out a sign that said, "Help yourself," in big, cheerful letters. Then I left, leaving the door ajar and the candy just inside it. All the lights stayed on, too, of course. The law student sits on the warped platform of the hiking shelter, watching the yellow embers of the lone fire in the common campsite slowly fade. It's been 2 hours now, and still no sign of the person who must have built the fire, but then left before the student even arrived here to hunker down for the night, exhausted after doing 16 miles since noon. Where could they have gone? No tent, no backpack, nothing. Just the fire, casting a smaller and smaller glow on the front rank of the undergrowth bordering the woods to the south. It's almost 11 o'clock when the stranger returns and departs the shadows 30 yards away, stepping back into the campsite. But then he just stands there. He seems to want to keep his face hidden in the dark. Finally, the student calls out a nervous hello. When a ranger passes through the next morning, he finds the law student's body in 3 different places. The upper torso lies beside the dead remains of the campfire. The legs, swarmed by flies, are on the platform of the shelter. The head, ravaged and earless on the left side, is found sitting beside the natural spring from which long-distance hikers draw their water. No one in local law enforcement had ever seen a head just sitting up like that, balanced in the leaves like it was a pencil topper, the dulled, bloated eyes staring into the woods. In gnawing on the scalp, the wolf that did all this left many of its own hairs entwined in its victims. To get to the cabin tonight, I took 287 to 206 north to 521 north. By the time it got dark, I was rolling down Struble Road past Lake Asherow. No sign of Halloween decorations or festivities out here. No way. Too remote. It's authentic autumn out here, and if you want to be scared, you only have to walk under the moonlight along one of the many unlit, winding country roads that surround the place where the cabin sits. The cabin was totally dark when I pulled up at 7:15, bumping along a dirt road for a few hundred yards as the surroundings got more and more wooded. The place has electric lights inside, but not outside. The lid of the cheap grill was sitting on the ground beside it. That's where I'd left it when we grilled some chicken early Saturday evening. For some reason, I didn't ever clean the grill or replace the lid. That was a somewhat rude thing to do, knowing some stranger had likely rented the cabin for next weekend. We'd left an empty bottle of whiskey on the ground, too. I went up to the front door. I still had the key to the door with me. That was in violation of the rental terms. I was supposed to have turned that in to a small rental office in town when we left. But I never had. And I didn't remember having any thought of it. I slid the key into the old lock. And I knew right away that I would never, ever be able to open that door. So many horrifying things can be behind them, you know. So many things. Haven't you ever felt that when you've gotten home at night? Every time that door is opened in, how can anyone return to a dark house, a dark apartment? How can you do that? One night just 2 weeks ago, I came awake at 4 a.m., sweating and gasping for air. "What's wrong?" Mandy asked, soothing me. In the nightmare, I was lost on a vast icy plain as daylight left a ghostly gray sky, and then a monster emerged from a crack in the ground and began to run toward me, snarling and whipping its head from side to side. A movie monster. That was something I'd never encountered before. One of the cave creatures from some flick called The Descent. Mandy held me close and pried something from my hand. It was the kitchen knife I sometimes used to slice steak when I made a stir-fry. I'd taken to going to bed with it, sitting on the nightstand beside me. Mandy had suggested it. And it did make a difference, I thought, at first. Just not much of one. I'm back in the car now. I'm not going in there. I can hear the sound the door will make if I push it open, inch by inch. I do have one hopeful thought, that after tonight, the problem of doors is solved forever. You see, because in prison, they open and close the doors for you. What might happen, you should be wondering. What might happen if two people who suffer terrible nightmares spend so many nights together that random chance brings a scenario in which they encounter their dreaming horrors at the same time? Maybe one of them comes awake, flailing and out of control, screaming, while the other is torn from their own nightmare at their bedmate's eruption of panic, completely disoriented. For maybe 3 seconds, neither grasps reality clearly, and both reach for their own weapons of comfort. In that state of temporary insanity, one of them perceives the moving shape in the darkness beside them to be a malevolent force intent on murder instead of love, and acts frantically in self-defense. I have the strange certainty that I didn't stab Mandy as many times as she stabbed me. That was 6 times. All relatively shallow wounds except for one, the one that keeps delivering waves of pain into my upper body. But I think my blows were far deeper. Peering through the dark, I can see the key sitting in the lock where I left it. Memories, in the form of vague, wispy images, are starting to come back now, little by little, brought on, I suppose, by my presence here, at the scene, as the police would say. Back in Edison, the children have taken all my candy by now, I hope. It would only be fitting if the very last trick-or-treater, maybe dressed as Jason Voorhees or Hannibal Lecter, decided to be nice and close my apartment door upon leaving. A drunk man in a Pennywise the Clown t-shirt, holding a can of Red Bull and telling his girlfriend to get off the phone already. 2 little girls dressed as characters from the Goosebumps movies, pointing toward a glow-in-the-dark scarecrow and trying to get their mother's attention to no avail. A couple in their early 60s who have come here to recapture a little of their youth, but wind up a little disturbed by the long lines and just how loud everything is. A tall man standing beside an oversized tractor at the edge of the cornfield watches them all as the last groups of the night leave the haunted house and trail and hayride and make their way back to their cars, picking up their pace when the rain starts. Finally, one little boy passing by, no more than 5 years old, sees the tall man and yells out, "Dracula!" But the boy's father only scoops him up in his arms, mildly irritated. It's been a long night of such shouting. Soon the tall man is utterly alone. "I will carve your headstone, unbeliever," he whispers to himself, not knowing why. It is a curious phrase that entered his mind from somewhere else, somewhere unknown. But he likes the sound of it. The rain clouds continue to gather, and he turns to head toward the lights of Edison.